So the world is wondering what this Trump presidency is going to be like come January when President Trump is sworn in. And so what I decided to do is we're going to be taking a look at the chart of JD Vance. And for those of you that don't know, JD Vance is the vice president that's going to be under the Trump administration, of course. But what I find interesting about JD Vance's chart is that both Trump and Vance both are Leo ascendant, and they both have the same rising nakshatra as well. So there's a lot of similarities with what's going on in their charts. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at that. Now, the plan for this video is we're going to be looking at a little bit of an overview of JD Vance's chart, and then we're also going to be looking at the near future to try to get an assessment of what are some of the upcoming events that could be associated with this Trump presidency. So for those of you that are new to my channel, make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks to all my new subscribers. And also, I do practice Vedic sidereal astrology, somewhat with my own twist, though. So I know some people are very orthodox, but I have my own ways of doing things as well. If you're interested in a private reading, check down below for details. And also, I just want to remind you all that this astrology reading is for entertainment purposes only. All these statements about, Donald Trump or JD Vance, they're all just my opinion of the astrology charts. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's talk about, and I brought this up now that Trump has won the presidency. What are we going to analyze? We're going to look at general traits as far as the chart goes with JD Vance. So we're going to kind of quickly just go through a few key points in the chart. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the current Vimshottari Dasha period and then some of the transits. What I found interesting, and we'll be exploring this a little bit later, is JD Vance just entered a new Mahadasha, it's a pretty big deal when you enter a new Mahadasha. It's like a whole new era of one's life, and it's a pretty serious one at that, and we'll explore that in a little bit. So let's go ahead and explore JD Vance's chart. And let me go back on a slide on that one. We're going to go pull up the astrology chart here. So let's pull that up. Like I said in the beginning, the interesting thing about JD Vance and Donald Trump, they both are Leo ascendant. Okay, both Leo ascendant, and they both have the same rising nakshatra, which is Maga nakshatra, which I find very interesting. So the transits in both astrology charts, they're influencing the same houses in both Trump's chart and JD Vance's chart. So I feel like they're both good to look at as far as there could be a similar experience that both are having during these transits and things like that. Now let's talk about a few brief things. Leo people tend to be very charismatic. They tend to be, center of the party when they walk in. They're very noticeable. I know people made comments that they thought he wears eyeliner. I don't know if he does or not, but I know that was a big thing. So usually the Leos have some sort of flair. And so definitely they tend to be very charismatic. He's got Mercury in the first house. This makes him very articulate, intelligent. I know he's already written a book, at least one book I know about. So he's got a certain aptitude, and he can articulate things quite well. He's got Moon in the second house. Mother could have been, the values of the mother could have been important for JD Vance, even though I think there was in his book, there was some issues there with the childhood upbringing and things. I haven't delved into it, but definitely he may share some sort of qualities or values of the mother. He's got this interesting Mars and Saturn conjunction that's going on in his chart. I noticed the same thing as in Prince William's chart. And so this shows with Mars and Saturn being together, there can be suppressed anger issues. It's kind of a push-pull dynamic. So there's this issue, there's this fear of innovation when Saturn's with Mars. And then also, even when he wants to move forward, there can just be blockages that seem to come from the outside, regulations or societal norms or societal standards. So there's always going to be this frustration. Whenever I see Saturn Mars together, there's a degree of frustration, in trying to move forward within an astrology chart. We got Ketu and Rahu on the 410 axis of the astrology chart. Well, one of the things I like to point out with Rahu being in the 10th house, and this is the same as Joe Biden's chart, by the way. He's got Rahu in the 10th house. There is a desire for leadership and recognition. The 10th house is all about public visibility, public responsibility. So there's definitely a soul desire within this incarnation to experience power, and he's already doing so. So this is, I think he's what, 40 years old. So he's getting pretty, a lot of power at a very young age. Even vice president, I know they're kind of more, people see them as ceremonial more in nature, but still being able to go to the White House, be part of a Trump presidency is pretty interesting. So there's that desire there. We've got Jupiter in the fifth house. This can represent the children being very important in life because, fifth house represents children. I think he's got 3 or 4 children. So, it's interesting that Jupiter is the multiplier. And also, Jupiter being in the fifth house could show somebody that's very creative. So he's probably going to write more books in the future, create more creative arts and creative situations like that. Let me clean up the chart a little bit. And also, the thing about these planets, we got Venus and Sun in the 12th house. The 12th house can represent our ancestors or spirit guides. So in this lifetime, spirituality, spirit guides are going to be very active within this lifetime. Okay, so that's one thing to point out about that. This could show somebody having an active spiritual life when they got these planets in the 12th house of the astrology chart. So let's go ahead and pull up the slide here. Excuse me. Let's pull up the slide here. We'll just talk about a few key points here. Leo ascendant, like I said, charismatic, authoritative. A lot of times they can be the face of a brand or something along those lines. There's a lot of actors, actresses that are Leo ascendant. He also has the rising nakshatra, both Trump and Vance, MAGA nakshatra, which is actually, it's a pretty mystical nakshatra, to be honest, but it's all about a love of tradition, inherited power from the ancestors. So, whether he knows it or not, he's got this strong blessing from his ancestors to do something great in the family line. So that's interesting. Now, the thing I put at the bottom of the slide was Trump and Vance are both Leo ascendant in MAGA nakshatra, which could show that they could definitely butt heads or have some ego. I'm calling it ego battles. So that's one thing. You got two astrology charts of people that think they're the lion. Okay, so that can be that'll be an interesting dynamic. That might not be something the public sees, but it may happen more in private, of course. But I will say in Trump's chart, he's got Mars in the first house, whereas Vance got Mercury. So Mars in the first house is going to be a little bit more ferocious than Mercury in the first house. Let's talk about a few other things in the astrology chart. We got Rahu in the 10th. We talked about that ambition for status. We got the Mars Saturn conjunction in the sign of Libra. There's this push-pull dynamic. Remember, frustration, suppressed anger can be some issues with that. The sun is exalted in the sign of Libra, so there can be a strong sense of justice and fairness. I think he did, a lot of times people that go into politics, they do get their law degree. I think he did get, so he may have this idea of a sense of nobility and justice and fairness and things, at least the idea of this world that has justice. Mercury in the first house, intelligent. Sun and Venus, spiritually inclined, spirit guides active. And then the Saturn karma, I was going to talk about that just for a moment. But remember with the planet Saturn, Saturn is going to be, the heavy karma is going to be associated with the house that Saturn's in. And then the house is 3 houses from itself, 7 houses, and 10 houses from Saturn. So those are going to be the areas of karmic lessons. So I'm just going over that really briefly because I'm sure we want to look at, kind of what's going to happen with this presidency. He's got Saturn in the 3rd house. There can be issues with siblings. Also, Saturn in the third house can also cause someone to be pessimistic. They got to be careful because this kind of placement with Saturn and Mars in the third house could lead to someone being bitter and later in life. So he's got to consciously manage that karma there. Fifth house, children creativity. So he's got children, but they can be a source of, there's a lot of energy required there. And that because Saturn represents there's some sort of energy drain. We got to devote a lot of energy. There's a karmic debt in those areas. Ninth house, karma with father figures, religion, traditional teachings. 12th house. So even though he's got Venus and Sun in the 12th house, he does have that 12th house aspect. So this is going to be like a struggle throughout the lifetime to find that solitude, that sanctuary, that private prayer, that retreat to be able to really experience that spiritual life. Okay. Because it might be one of those situations where he really has to make the time to do it because the world around him is not going to allow him to really have this active spiritual life. So let's go bring the chart back up one more time. We just did a little brief overview. I mean, we could go really deep into that. There's a lot of layers, like layers of an onion when we look at an astrology chart. And then there's divisional charts and the Navamsa chart. But we just wanted to get a brief little snapshot. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at what's kind of currently happening. When I make this video, it's November 18th when I'm making the video. But what's interesting is the president's going to be sworn in, I believe, around the third week of January. And I don't remember the exact day, but so January is going to be when the presidency actually takes effect. So there's still this transition period. And that's what I really want to talk about. I feel like this transition period could be a little rocky in both Trump's chart and Vance's chart. We're going to be focusing on Vance's chart here. So let's pull the chart back up again. One of the major things, and let's talk about the Vimshottari Dasha first. And this is the planetary timeline. So he just entered this Saturn period. He's in the Saturn timeline. He entered that in April of 2024. That's a 19-year period, by the way. So this is just the very beginning, which is considered Saturn Bhukti, or Saturn, okay? And this Saturn period is going to be April 2024 to April 2027. It's 3 years, 2027. So this is what we're going to be focusing on is Saturn. So Saturn, what it usually brings up is karmic debts in more difficult situations. What I find interesting about this astrology chart is you can usually tell when someone just enters a Mahadasha like that, like in April. The thing about is it can take about a year, especially when it's a longer Mahadasha like Saturn. It can take about a year for this Mahadasha to really come into full effect. And if you think about it, by the time Trump gets sworn in January, that's really when this Mahadasha, the energy, is going to be experienced more in full force. Now, I do think there's could be some issues during the transition. We'll talk about that with some of the transits, but let's bring up Saturn first. So Saturn represents heavy karma, and for Leo ascendant, it's not a good period at all because it rules the sixth house. So the sixth house is enemies. It can represent war even. So when we're looking at a politician's chart, if we see the sixth house being activated, it can represent warfare. The other thing to consider is that Saturn is next to Mars. So this whole period, this whole 3-year period, Saturn with Mars, we got the sixth lord, which represents warfare and conflict. Then we got Mars, which is the karaka of warfare and conflict. So this seems like right on the beginning of this, just looking at this, that the astrological period he's in, well, this is a difficult energy here. Okay. So there could be some sort of conflict experienced. But also it could be personal conflict as well. So I do want to bring that up. Maybe it's going to be butting heads with a lot of people in the cabinet or the White House or what have you. It could also represent that. But that's really interesting to me is that this frustration. There might be this frustration of not being able to act. He may have a lot of good ideas, and just being a vice president, maybe he doesn't get the fully enact those ideas. Okay, so there could be a lot of frustration there. Like maybe he's very idealistic. He thinks he's going to make all of these changes, but Saturn with Mars is like, nope, there's not really much changes. You just need to show up to the meetings. The third house can represent like all these boring meetings that you got to go to. The reason why I say boring meetings is because it's Saturn in the third house. So these boring long meetings, and maybe he doesn't have a lot of authority. Now, worst case scenario, it could actually represent during this period that there's going to be some serious stuff going on in the country. In Trump's chart, we do kind of have we have Saturn activated in Trump's chart. Remember, he's in a Venus Antardasha, and he's got Saturn in the 12th house with Venus. So I noticed that this really heavy karma is in both charts as far as the planetary dasha that they're both experiencing. So that's a little bit of an overview there. Seventh house, definitely, it can bring up marriage stuff too. He's probably going to be very busy. Maybe there could be some issues there with marriage life. So he's got to be careful with that. Let's talk about a few of the transits here. So that's just the general period for the next 3 years, the Saturn energy. The other thing I want to bring up is specifically for the next 6 months is the Rahu and Ketu transit. Okay, so Rahu and Ketu, if we look at that, Rahu's in the 8th house of Pisces, and then Ketu's in the 2nd house of Virgo. So what this can represent is, first of all, when Rahu's going through the 8th house, now he's not in a Rahu period, but Rahu, when it's in the 8th house, it can thin the veil somewhat. And 8th house can represent shocking things, emergencies, financial crises. It can represent things like tragic events and things like that. So I'm already kind of a little bit keeping my eye on this because Rahu's in the 8th house of Trump's chart right now and Vance's chart. Okay. Now that started back in October of 2023, the Rahu transit through the 8th house. So currently it's in the 8th house until May of 2025. And I believe it's May 15th. Okay. So May 15th of 2025, or sorry, it's May 18th, I believe. Okay. May 18th. May 18th of 2025, that's when Rahu's going to finally go backwards into the 7th house. Okay. But this is the transition period that we're discussing with this transition to this new presidency. He's got this Rahu going to the 8th house, which could bring up some really interesting events. So he's already got Saturn and Mars. These are malefic planets being activated with the planetary period. Then he's got Rahu in the 8th house, which could definitely trigger a crisis. That's what the 8th house represents. And it's in both of their charts. So there's confluence here. Okay. Right now, as of when I make this video, there's a lot of issues that are happening in Eastern Europe. So there's been some new developments there, and the world is a little bit on edge with this whole situation. And then, of course, we have the situation in the Middle East. The 8th house energy could represent literally, like, even during the transition, there could be some issues even during the transition, some international issues. And in Trump's chart, remember, Venus is in the 12th house, which can represent international issues that are happening. So something internationally, but is going to be affecting the presidency. Let's talk about, and this is something I want to point out, is the Saturn transit, which is in the 7th house right now. But I really want to key into, and 7th house, by the way, when it's in the 7th house, there's this idea of trying to find equity. There can be a lot of issues with one's like marriage and a focus on marriage partnerships when Saturn's in the 7th house. So that's definitely occurring right now. The Saturn transit, it started back in January 2023, but it's going to end here March 29th of 2025. So we're entering the last period of this Saturn transit. So there's a lot of heavy karma usually associated when you're in the last few months of the Saturn transit. There's usually some heavy karma bringing up. This just happens to be right in this transition period of, the Biden presidency leaving and the Trump administration coming in. So we could definitely see it's going to be a little bit rocky since it's right in the last stages of this Saturn transit. So right away we know okay, Rahu in the eighth, Saturn's already in the last stages of this transit. There could definitely be some situation going on. What I'm concerned about in both Vance's chart and Trump's chart is at the end of March, March 29th, when Saturn goes into the eighth house of Pisces, and I'm going to make videos for all 12 signs, by the way, when that happens. But March 29th, 2025, that's when Saturn's going to change signs. And in both of their charts, it's going to be, so Rahu's going to be, going backwards into Aquarius. It's like Saturn and Rahu are going to switch signs essentially. But what I find interesting, Saturn's entering the eighth house. Um, that's a little bit of an issue. Okay, so let's talk about this Saturn in the eighth house beginning in March. So keep in mind that the Trump administration starts, towards the third week or so of January, and then just 2 months later in March, Saturn's going to change signs. Well, Saturn, when it's in the eighth house, usually, and it's going to be both Trump's and Vance's chart, it usually brings up a crisis. It usually brings up some sort of emergency. The eighth house, and what happens, and I want to explain this, is at the beginning of the transit, that's usually when the emergency starts. So at the beginning of the transit, there's some sort of emergency that happens. It could be a catastrophic situation. Now, for most people, it's a personal issue. Could be like a financial issue because eighth house can represent like bankruptcy or restructuring debt. It can also represent things like divorce because eighth house has that meaning as well. But it also can represent things like disasters, crises, international crises. So when I'm taking it to these world leaders, which are going to be in the White House, we got Saturn entering the eighth house. There could be a crisis of some sort. I'm also putting this up with, remember, Saturn is the most important planet for Vance because he's in a Saturn Mahadasha right now. And Saturn is the sixth lord. There could be an international crisis around this time if I'm looking at both of their charts. Something big that could happen, and then there's kind of we're kind of in a frozen state of crisis. Because what happens is the crisis emerges when Saturn enters the eighth house, and then everything kind of freezes. So the response to the crisis is very slow. So, for example, Saturn represents like a glacier moving, it's very slow. So there could be something sudden that happens, and then the response is very delayed, very inadequate, not enough resources, maybe not enough whatever they need to respond to this crisis. It's taking a long time. It's very delayed. So this crisis that we're talking about could last a couple of years. Okay. Now, like I said, it could be a personal crisis as well. So when we look at the royal family, for example, when we look at King Charles and Catherine, Princess of Wales, you notice that this last couple of years, they've had their Cancer ascendant, they've had Saturn in the eighth house, and we know what happened. There was those diagnoses that happened. And so they had this personal crisis. So there's definitely a crisis that's going to be emerging. The crisis could be, and let me list a couple of crises. If we're thinking about international crisis with the eighth house, it could represent a financial crisis of some sort. Okay. Especially considering that when Saturn enters the eighth house, Rahu's still going to be there till May. So there could be like a financial crisis, or it could be an international conflict around this time. So this window between March and May, I feel, is going to be very key with what's happening in the Trump Vance administration here in the near future. We also could see some things in the near future as well, just with Rahu being in the eighth house. So I do feel like we're in for a wild ride. And I don't think it's going to go as smoothly as everyone thinks. There's, after a president is elected, there's kind of like this honeymoon period where at least half the people in the country have the honeymoon period, right? Where people are excited and there's a lot of promises made, and then reality hits. And that's kind of what I feel like we're going to be experiencing. So let me know what you think down below in the comments. What do you think is going to happen with this presidency? Let me know. And I will see you all in the next video very soon. So thank you and take care.